Hi, everybody. Welcome to my screencast. I am going to spend some time today teaching you about how to use passenger and crew lists. These lists are very significant because in genealogical research, because they help us to determine not only the ports of entry and embarkation and debarkation of our ancestors, but also they teach us information about our ancestors that may not appear in other vital records. So the database I'm using today is from an index that's held by the National Archives here in the United States, and it can be accessed either directly through the National Archives or through repositories such as Ancestry.com's free non-subscription side, and also through Family Search, for example. The site that you see here is just the Ancestry.com's entry into the National Archives index. And I have pulled up, just by way of example, the Massachusetts passenger and crew list between 1820 and 1963. Each immigration and migration vital records can be different depending on location that boats left from and also where they landed in the US. So please keep that in mind when you're looking at migration records and passenger and crew lists, depending on where your ancestors are from. So I find these lists from the Massachusetts passenger and crew to be particularly useful, like I said, because of the information that they contain that goes even beyond migration information. So I've done a little sample here with an ancestor of mine. Her name is Catherine Donovan, and you can see that I have not checked the exact box. And the reason for that is that sometimes Catherine Donovan's name is spelled with a C and sometimes with a K. So I'm leaving the parameters open, similar to birth year, which is not known to the specific date, and also to the migration year, which is known to the specific date in this case, but I want to have a little bit of wiggle room in case records weren't kept correctly. And I also know the port of arrival, which in this case is Boston, Massachusetts. Or Suffolk County, Massachusetts. One thing to note in all of these records held by the National Archives is that the port of entry and the port of debarkation are not always accurate, in the sense that the boats that these passengers are listed on sometimes stop at more than one, sometimes as many as up to 3 or 4 different ports of entry. And so it's helpful, at least at the beginning of a search, to not overly restrict the search to one port of entry by clicking exact for ports of entry, because that will overly limit the kinds of records that you find. So each of the passenger lists in this index are also related to rolls of microfilm that are held at the National Archives. So the rolls can be found in the drop-down menu on the right-hand side here if the roll of record is known. So that's a helpful resource to get directly to the listing of your ancestors, if you happen to know already by looking at other indexes what role the record is from. But using optical search recognition software, the National Archives and, for example, Ancestry.com, which this screenshot is taken from, you're able to search by last and first name of all of the records included in the database. So that's really helpful in case you happen to not know the exact date or role that corresponds to the point of entry. So we're going to move forward to see where this search takes us and what information is known that can be found from these passenger and crew lists of migration records. So as promised, there are a number of Donovans and Catherine Donovans. And if you remember, I didn't actually select exact for the records of Catherine Donovan. So what I've had to do is sort of sift through some of the appropriate matches in terms of birth year and arrival date, or at least suspected arrival date and birth year. And you can see on the left-hand side here that I have a spectrum where I'm able to push forward and backward by a few years, a broader or more exact search. And I believe that the first record I found based on other genealogical research, this first record, which is for Catherine Donovan, or Kath Donovan, is the record that matches my ancestor. And so I can see here that I'm able to actually view the image from the passenger and crew list that Catherine Donovan was a immigrant on, or is listed on. And so I'm going to open that and just share with you what kind of information is available on those passenger and crew lists. So here we have the passenger and crew list, and this list is from 1901. And the ship name and location is at the top of the crew list, which I'll share with you in the next screenshot. But I just wanted to go over some of the detail that are on these passenger and crew lists, remembering that not all passenger and crew lists, depending on point of entry and point of debarkation, include the same information. But the majority of passenger migration crew lists and passenger lists do include some combination of the following information. So like I mentioned earlier, there's a wealth of information available about each of the passengers on the list. Some of the key information that I learned about my ancestor from the passenger lists into Suffolk County, Boston in 1901 were name and age, obviously, whether or not the person was married. My ancestor is listed as married. Occupation or calling is the title of the occupation column. So if somebody is a spouse and is a woman, at least on these passenger lists, they're usually referred to as wife. Whether or not the person's able to read, which is important information because that is not necessarily included in every census that we've been looking at. So that's useful information. The last place of residence, which is helpful when ancestors have lived in more than one country or more than one location prior to arrival. The designated seaport for landing. So that's when I mentioned earlier that ships often have gone to many different ports of entry. The final destination seaport is listed on the passenger list. Whether or not a person has a ticket to their final destination in the United States. And this information is useful because if a ticket and a final destination was known, which it is in my ancestor's case, then that helps to trace to a next address or a next location that then can be used in other vital records or other records like census data, etc. One useful piece of information is whether or not the person listed on the passenger list has a ticket to that final destination, and if so, who it was paid by. So, like all genealogical research, these pieces of information are little breadcrumbs that can help us to put together a much more robust picture of the migration patterns and also the relationships between people on the passenger list and people who may have already been established as residents in the United States. We learn how much money the person has on their travel that they're traveling with, and specifically whether or not the amount of money is more or less than $30. We learn from these passenger lists if the person has been in the United States before, and if so, where. So I actually learned from my ancestor, looking at this passenger list, that she actually had been in the United States before, which was a piece of information I was not aware of. We're also asked a couple of very specific questions that we learned from these passenger lists. One is whether or not the person is a practicing polygamist, and whether or not the person has been either in prison or supported by a charity. Finally, we learn about the physical and mental health of the person, not in great detail, but just a simple yes, no, answering the question, is this person in sound mental and physical health, and are there any deformities, as is listed on the passenger manifest for this passenger. So one thing that I did notice is that there were very few no's and answers to those questions. So I would like to use this document for further information when it comes to looking up health records, if any were taken at the points of entry, and if so, where those are housed. And finally, as promised, I wanted to share where one can find the actual ship name, which can be useful in further research of our ancestors. So at the top of the passenger and crew manifest, we have the ship name, which in this case is the Dominion line, and then the list of all people aboard the ship, which we've gone through in great detail in the slide prior to this one. And then finally, the date that the boat was sailing from and where it was sailing into. So where it was leaving from and where it was coming into. Keeping in mind, as I said earlier, that many of the boats that these passenger manifests or lists are associated with have stopped at many points of entry and debarkation. So that's not always the kind of end all be all of where the people on these boats have been and have come from, but it's a very good starting place to know both the ship name and the arrival and departure port. So I hope this was helpful information. This is just one example of a passenger list, especially to a place like Massachusetts where there was pretty heavy immigration between the dates that these passenger lists are kept. So up until the 1930s, particularly from Ireland, that the National Archives holds these records. Is really good information to have for deepening the knowledge that we seek for our ancestors. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.